Hello, and welcome to the fifth episode of Essence of Wonder. Today we have a special guest, somebody I appreciate personally, and am excited to have on the show, Cory Doctorow. We'll talk about him more in depth in a bit. We also have a panel following that speaking about digital policy and what happens with when it encounters privacy and security concerns. And then the panelists and Cory will take it wherever they would like, but that's where we intend to start. Thank you for being here. The panelists will be Steve Crocker, Keren Elazari, Gula, Dmitri Alperovich, and Caleb Sima. I'm Gadi Evron, and this is Essence of Wonder. And now, introducing Cory. Cory, I met very recently, although we've been in the same circles for a while. I would say I appreciate him a lot, even look up to him. He has done a lot for this industry and for the internet in general. He has helped to establish the Open Rights Group as part of the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He is a tireless campaigner for the eradication of digital rights management, or DRM, and I believe he'll also talk to us about that. He won the Prometheus Award 3 times. And he originated Doctorow's Law, which is, let me read that for you so I get it right. Anytime someone puts a lock on something you own against your wishes and doesn't give you the key, they are not doing it for your benefit. So with that, Cory, how are you doing today?
Hi, thanks. I'm doing as well as can be expected under the circumstances, I suppose. Hanging in there. Not sick, not bankrupt, so better than many people in our world today.
True enough. I would like to just add something extra here saying about my appreciation for you and your work. You have, I hope I don't embarrass you too badly, but I'm going to try. You have not only helped lead this front around digital rights, you also understand the technology pretty deeply. You have brought a unique view where you actually say, this is the policy we want to create, but here is how it should work, not just because of ideology, but because of this is the technological aspect of this. And then from the other side, I've seen you in technical forums saying, this is the ideology we should look to when we consider issues such as this. And you've also written way, way more books than anybody should be able to. Just one question for you before we really move forward with all of this. Is there, like Doctorow's Law, is there some guiding principle that you follow when you look at any of these technical digital discussions, or do you go in with knowing what you know and shape that?
I guess there are a variety of overarching principles. I'm going to talk today a little about the idea of technological self-determination, that if we think that people are going to have a good technological life, it's important to help them understand technological issues, and it's important to give them a range of choices that they can make, but it's also important to let them make those choices, even sometimes when those choices are foolish, because although it can be bad for a user to stumble into a poor technological choice, if we take away the right to choose from a user, the failure mode there is actually much worse, which is that someone who doesn't have the user's interests in mind, or who's wrong about what's best for the user, might make a choice that the user can't override. And so I would say that technological self-determination for me feels like the necessary but insufficient principle for a better technological future. And then on top of that, things like holding firms to account for their bad actions and having responsive and legitimate governments and all of the other things that we need. But all of those things are hamstrung if people can't choose which technology they use and how they use them.
Fair enough. And this will bring us to your reading, and the rest of the hour is yours. And then we can move on to the panel and see how these ideologies we should follow run into realities. Thank you for that. Please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Gadi. Hi, folks. So my plan today, I'm going to read to you a little from a novella called Unauthorized Bread. It's the opening story of a book I published last year called Radicalized, just out in paperback. Unauthorized Bread is a standalone novella about digital rights management and technology and technological self-determination, and what I sometimes call the bad technology adoption curve, where really bad technological ideas tend to get crammed down the throats of people who don't have any social power. And then once they've been normalized, we all end up having to adopt them. So 20 years ago, if you had a camera watching you while you ate dinner, chances would be that that camera was there because you were in a supermax prison. Today, if there's a camera watching you while you eat dinner, it's much more likely that it's there because you were unwise enough to buy like Google Home or Alexa or something. And so that's how we see the bad technology adoption curve. It gets its corners knocked off, and it gets normalized by trying it out on kids and refugees and poor people. And then it eventually gets inflicted on people who have more and more social power until pretty much everyone is in a position where they can't resist it any longer. So the setup for the bit I'm going to read is that Salima, who's our hero in this novella, is living in subsidized refugee housing. And her appliances, which are all smart appliances that she didn't get to choose, that her landlord has installed to get extra money out of his subsidized tenants, have stopped working. And she's decided to fix her toaster, which comes from a company called Boulangism. The Boulangism didn't go easily. After downloading the new firmware from the darknet, she had to remove the case, slicing through 3 separate tamper evidence seals, and a large warning sticker that threatened electrocution and prosecution, perhaps simultaneously, for anyone fool enough to ignore it, and locate a specific component, and then short out 2 of its pins with a pair of tweezers while booting it. This dropped the toaster into a test mode that the developers had deactivated, but not removed. The instant the test screen came up, she had to jam in her USB stick. When she removed the toaster's hood, she'd revealed a set of USB ports, a monitor port, and even a little Ethernet jack, all stock on the commodity single-board PC that controlled it. At exactly the right instant, and then use the on-screen keyboard to type in the login and password, which were admin and admin, of course. It took her 3 tries to get the timing right, but on the 3rd try, the spare login screen was replaced with the pirate firmware's cheesy text art animation of a 3D skull, which she smiled at. And then she burst into laughter as a piece of text art toast floated into the frame and was merrily chomped to crumbs by the text art skull, the crumbs cascading onto the bottom of the screen and forming little shifting piles. Someone had put a lot of effort into the physics simulation for that ridiculous animation. It made Salima feel good, like she was entrusting her toaster to deep, serious craftspeople, and not just randos who like to pit their wits against the faceless programmers of big, stupid companies. The crumbs piled up as the skull chomped, and the progress indicator counted up from 12% to 26%, and then to 34%, where it stuck for a full 10 minutes, until she was ready to risk really bricking the damn thing by unplugging it, but then 58%, and so on to an agonizing wait at 99%, and then all the crumbs rushed up from the bottom of the screen and went back out through the skull's mouth, turning back into toast, each reassembled piece forming up in ranks that quickly blotted out the skull, and the words "all done" burned themselves into the toast surface, glistening with butter that ran down in rivulets. She was just grabbing her phone to get a picture of this awesome pirate load screen when the toaster oven blinked and rebooted itself. A few seconds later, she held a slice of bread to the toaster sensor and watched as its light turned green and its door yawned open. Halfway through munching the toast, she was struck by an odd curiosity. She held up her hand to the toaster, palm out, as though it too were a slice of bread. The toaster's light turned green, and the door opened. She was momentarily tempted to try to toast a fork or a paper towel or a slice of apple just to see if the toaster would do it, but of course it would. This was a new kind of toaster, a toaster that took orders rather than giving them, a toaster that would give her enough rope to hang herself, let her toast a lithium battery or a can of hairspray or anything else she wanted to toast. Unauthorized bread, even homemade bread. The idea made her feel a little queasy and a little tremorous. Homemade bread was something she'd read about in books and seen in old dramas, but she didn't know anyone who actually baked bread. That was like gnawing your furniture out of whole logs or something. The ingredients turned out to be incredibly simple. And while her first loaf came out looking like a poop emoji, it tasted amazing, still warm from the little toaster, and if anything, the slice, it was a lump, that she saved and toasted the next morning was even better, especially with butter on it. She left for work that day with a magical, warm, toasty feeling in her stomach. So yeah, that's how the story, it's not quite how it opens, but it happens pretty early in that story, Unauthorized Bread. And the whole story is available as a free read on Ars Technica. If you type unauthorized bread Ars Technica into your favorite search engine, whether that's Alta Vista or Ask Jeeves, you'll find it very quickly. It's also had a kind of second life. It's available as an audiobook from Macmillan Audio, read by the very talented reader Lemise Isaac. And you can also follow it along as it's being turned into a graphic novel with Jen Doyle by First Second. And it's also being turned into a TV series by The Intercept's parent company, Topic. So there's lots of stuff happening with that story, and the book itself that it's in, the Radicalized, is a finalist for the Canadian National Book Prize, the Canada Reads Prize. Unfortunately, the final round of voting for the Canada Reads Prize has been canceled by the pandemic. So we may all be winners at this rate, but it's hard to say. But I did want to talk about like the policy questions that underpin this before I open it up to Q&A, since Gadi teed up some of those policy questions. So although toasters that limit which bread you can toast are few and far between, there was in fact a toaster oven on the market a couple of years ago that would only heat up certain meals if they had the right QR code. There is an increasing trend to devices being tied to their consumables and to certain service paths and service depots, and also parts. So, you know, you may be accustomed to the idea that if you bought a DVD player in the 90s, that it would only play DVDs that came from the same country as the DVD player. Or if you bought a Sega Dreamcast, it would only play games that had come out of a Sega Dreamcast factory and not homebrew games that, you know, your neighbor might have hacked together. Or maybe you're familiar with the idea that your iPhone will only run apps that come from Apple's official iPhone store. As time has gone by, we've seen an explosion in that kind of tying. You know, now it's the case that many cars, their engines won't recognize parts unless the parts complete a cryptographic handshake that indicates that they're original parts that came from the manufacturer. More intensely, companies like John Deere, which make you know, $500,000 and up heavy agricultural equipment. Even if you take a John Deere part that came from a John Deere factory and install it in your John Deere tractor, as farmers have been doing for as long as tractors have existed. I mean, farmers have been fixing their stuff since agriculture began. I mean, there's a reason that every barn has got a fix-it shop and sometimes even a forge attached to it. It's because, you know, when you're at the end of a long country road, you can't wait for the fix-it person to show up and fix your stuff. You know, you've got to make hay while the sun shines. So even if the farmer takes the part from John Deere and puts it in their John Deere tractor and does so correctly, the tractor will not start to recognize the part until a John Deere technician has come out to the farm and typed an unlock code into the keyboard. We also see this with some Apple devices. The iPhone 10, the digitizer, the screen that comes with the iPhone 10, if you swap a working digitizer from a busted phone into a working phone with a busted screen, the new phone, the new Franken phone, the phone you just swapped the screen into, won't recognize the screen again until an Apple service technician types an unlock code into it and unlocks it. So we're seeing this all over the place. We see it in medical devices. Johnson & Johnson has a patent for an insulin pump that will only accept insulin from a special vendor. We just saw Abbott Labs, which is one of the med tech giants of Silicon Valley, shut down a third-party app that allows people who have diabetes who use their continuous glucose monitor to access the data from their own bloodstream, and so on. And, you know, it's a very strange thing to see these emerging in the market, because these are not things that anyone wants, right? Nobody walked into an electronics store in the 90s and said, you know, I really want to make sure that if I buy a DVD player but bring home a DVD from Europe, that it won't play. Do you have any DVD players that come with that restriction? And nobody ever called up Apple and said, when you sell me a phone, I want to be really sure that if I someday decide that I don't like your app store, that I can't use someone else's app store. Can you make sure that this phone rejects my attempts to choose someone else's app store? And certainly no one with diabetes ever said, I want to make sure that my insulin pump can only run the insulin that is approved by the vendor and that they've gotten their markup out of, and not any commodity insulin that has been made and marketed at cost instead. After all, Banting and Best, who discovered insulin and first created the idea of an insulin therapeutic for diabetes, didn't patent insulin because they wanted to make sure that it would be sold at cost for people who had this potentially lethal disease, and so on and so on. So you would think that in a world where you have printer manufacturers who are selling ink at prices that exceed the cost of vintage champagne, and where you have tools being sold to diagnose car engines that cost $100 to make but cost $10,000 to own, that competitors would move in, that they would move in and say, that sounds like a good deal to me. I would like to take your 5 million% margin on John Deere engine parts and make a part that has a mere 500% margin, and invite farmers to make their own decision about the risk profile that is most important to them, and whether they want to use the original parts or third-party parts. And there's a reason that those competitors haven't appeared in the market. And that's because in 1998, the US Congress passed into law the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It was sponsored by Barney Frank. It was a bipartisan bill. It enjoyed wide support. Bill Clinton signed it into law. And it's a big, gnarly hairball of copyright law. But the most important section for the purposes of this story and also this world that we live in is Section 1201. And Section 1201, the anti-circumvention section, says that if you have a lock that restricts access to a copyrighted work, and someone removes that lock or tampers with it, that the person who makes the tool to remove or tamper with the lock commits a felony, punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine for a first offense. And so what that means is that if you can design your product so that using it in ways that benefit the owner of the product at the expense of your shareholders requires that you remove the lock, that because removing the lock is a crime, displeasing your shareholders becomes a crime, right? You can turn the DMCA into felony contempt of business model. Now, those of you who are watching from outside the US may be feeling a little smug right now. Maybe you're a European thinking, well, look at those stupid Americans who threw themselves off a cliff in 1998. I've got bad news for you. In 2001, the European Parliament adopted the European Copyright Directive, Article 6 of which makes it a crime to tamper with copyright access controls. Or maybe you're a Canadian. I'm a Canadian, and I know that Canadians like to make a kind of national pastime out of feeling superior to Americans and their stupid laws. But Canada enacted this in 2011. And being stupid enough to pass this law in 1998, when it was a racket to make sure that people bought their DVDs in the same country that they bought their DVD players, was stupid enough. But to do this in 2011, with all we knew by then, both about how the world was moving in terms of digital and also how the law had played out, that's just felony stupid. And there's some really important consequences of this law, not just for what we might call consumer freedom or competition or the right to technological self-determination. Apropos the panel we're going to have after this, there are some really important consequences for security as well. Because if in the course of discovering whether or not a device can be trusted to be, say, implanted inside your body, or for you to put your body inside of, right? Whether a car can be trusted to not be remotely hackable, as 1.25 million Jeeps were in 2015. If in the process of auditing a device, you happen to beg your pardon, tamper with the copyright access control, for example, to see how the code works, you also violate the DMCA. And this is not a theoretical risk. We know that security researchers, or more importantly, that their faculty advisors or general counsel or investors do not want to incur the wrath of large corporations. And so they are chilled from investigating systems that have DRM in them. So once you add digital rights management to a system, you create this kind of unauditable attack surface that bad guys can attack and investigate and exploit and use to attack your customers. But good guys cannot investigate without your sufferance, without your say-so, without risking your wrath. And we've had companies like Oracle send out memos to their customers saying, we consider it a crime for you to audit the products we've sold you. And more recently, Apple has sued an independent company that makes a runtime for iPhones that allows people to do security investigations into iOS. And at the same time, we've seen security researchers and firms that do security testing of iOS devices say that they're not willing to use that tool anymore because they're worried that they will be named as a party to the Apple lawsuit. So all of this has a second order consequence as well for the kind of monopolization that we see in the tech industry. And that monopolization ties in very closely to this right to repair story and to what we're seeing now in the pandemic as smaller firms are failing and bigger firms are buying them up, as Amazon just bought Deliveroo. Historically, the tech industry has gone through these waves of consolidation and then fragmentation as one firm uses the things that the tech industry bequeaths on successful firms like network effects and first mover advantage to grow to dominate the market, say the way that IBM did or AT&T did. But then because of the nature of computers, because computers have this general purpose nature, rivals of the firm that dominates the industry are able to make new products that talk to the existing dominant products and services and that allow their customers to have one foot in the dominant platform and one foot in the new challenger platform, the upstart platform. So for example, one of the earliest stories of this is the growth of cable television. Before cable television was a thing, we just had UHF broadcasts. And in rural Pennsylvania, there was a town where the local television salesman was having trouble selling TVs to his customers because they were too far from either Pittsburgh or Philly to receive over-the-air signals. And so he put up what was called a community access television antenna. So he put up a giant antenna and he ran wires into his customers' homes and he charged them money to access the broadcast signals that he was getting for free. Right, so that's a really early example. He didn't need the broadcaster's permission. And in fact, he did this over the howls of protest from the broadcasters, but he was able to do it because there were no digital locks on those signals. If there had been digital rights management on the signals, if the signals had been scrambled, they could have attacked him for descrambling the signal without permission. But because he didn't need their permission to receive or demodulate those signals, he could then build new follow-on businesses that created the whole cable industry. A little earlier than that, you had the story of AT&T Unix. AT&T created Unix as a skunkworks project in Bell Telephone Labs, where they had some of their most esteemed computer scientists and researchers like Ritchie and so on working. And they were not able to commercialize it because they had been dinged by the Federal Trade Commission for being a monopolist. And actually, the only thing that had saved them from being broken up in the 1950s was that they had been crucial to the U.S. military effort in Korea. And so the Pentagon went to the Department of Justice and said, "Don't break up AT&T." So the DOJ said, "Fine, we won't break you up, but you can't start any new businesses in any new industries." So after Unix was invented, they couldn't commercialize it. And when the Unix creators did a talk at an Association for Computing Machinery meeting, other people were so interested in it that they went to AT&T and demanded that they license it to them. And so AT&T, even though they weren't allowed to make their own Unix, were required under the terms of this agreement to allow their rivals to commercialize Unix. And it created this whole thriving community of different Unixes that today have grown to dominate the world, right? The operating system in your smart light bulb and the operating system in your phone and the operating system in your computer are all likely descendants of AT&T Unix. Or look at what Apple did, right? When Apple started, or when Apple hit its inflection point, when Microsoft had started to edge it out of the enterprise market by failing to keep up the Microsoft Office suite for the Mac, so that Word documents created on the Mac didn't work well on Windows, and Word documents created in Windows didn't work on the Mac, so that if you had an Office that was Mac and Windows, you sort of had to choose one or the other. Apple said, we're not going to rely on Microsoft to allow us to use, to talk to Microsoft customers. We're going to reverse engineer all of the Microsoft Office suite and make the iWork suite that can read and write Microsoft documents without Microsoft's cooperation or permission. If there had been DRM or software patents or any of the other modern techniques that are used by firms to fence out their competitors, they wouldn't have been able to do that. And then you have Google, right, which started off its business by showing up at websites and saying, hey, I'm just a browser, right? I'm not a robot, I'm a browser, give me your web pages, right? So by impersonating a browser, they were able to start their index and build an index that made them part of the internet. And then they grew, and they eventually tightened up and started sending user agent strings that identified them as a robot, but they were able to show up and be indistinguishable from a browser for the purposes of web servers. And then you have Facebook, which when it was founded, faced this uphill battle because its major competitor was an incredibly well-capitalized dominant firm called MySpace that had just gotten a huge cash infusion from Rupert Murdoch, who's considered one of the most ruthless and effective businessmen in the world. And rather than ask people to leave behind all their friends on MySpace and go to the empty Facebook pages where their friends were not, but where there was a better user interface, Facebook created a tool that allowed former MySpace users to have Facebook on their behalf log into MySpace, grab their waiting messages, put them in their Facebook inbox, and let them reply and push that back out again. But over the years, laws like Section 12(1) of the DMCA and software patents and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act have allowed these firms that used adversarial interoperability to pull up the adversarial interoperability ladder behind them, right? For the pirates to become admirals and to force away any new competitor that would use this tactic against them, right? Their story goes, well, when we did adversarial interoperability, that was like a legitimate competitive activity that contributed to a dynamic market. But when you do adversarial interoperability, you're stealing our IP, you're undermining our security, you're hacking our systems, and you're violating the law. So one of the ways that this has become very sharp in this moment is in the right to repair. Because although no legislature has ever passed a law saying you're not allowed to fix your stuff or choose who fixes your stuff, and indeed quite the reverse, Congress passed a law that said, even if you fix your own stuff or take it to a third-party service center, the manufacturer is not allowed to void your warranty. Manufacturers have figured out ways to make it illegal to get your stuff fixed by anyone except them. And they use that, first of all, to gouge you on parts and service, but second of all, and equally importantly, to decide when you have to spend money to buy a new product from them, because the advantage that they get from being able to decide whether your thing can or can't be fixed is they get to decide whether or not your thing is going in the garbage. And it's not for nothing that Tim Cook, at the start of 2019, in his first address to his shareholders, said, our biggest risk to our profits is that people are holding on to Apple products for too long. They're choosing to get them fixed instead of buying new ones. Well, if it's also not a coincidence that Apple fought and defeated 20 state-level right to repair bills that would have forced Apple to provide manuals, parts, and technical assistance to third parties who wanted to keep those elderly devices going. Apple wants them in a landfill so that you have to buy another one. So you may have heard, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. And I think what we've learned during the pandemic and through the right to repair struggle during the pandemic is that even if you pay for the product, you are the product, right? Farmers don't get John Deere tractors for free in exchange for listening to ads or watching ads. They spend $500,000 on them, and then they're still treated as the product, because the real deal is, if you're not, even if you're paying for the product, you will be the product, provided the company can get away with it. If they don't have to fear competitors, they will do everything and anything they can to suck money out of your wallet, because their shareholders are their priority, not your happiness. Your happiness only matters to the extent that you might displease their shareholders by buying someone else's product. And when they needn't fear competition, when they can lock you in, they can change the balance of how miserable they can make you before you defect to a third-party product. And during the pandemic, the right to repair, as I said, has become super intense, because it's no longer a matter merely of displeasing their shareholders by getting stuff fixed. In many cases, the firms we might want to fix our things are either pausing their business. So, Apple shut down its Apple Care and just sat on the laptops that people had sent to it to get repaired. Or they've gone out of business entirely, or they can't be reached because they're in China or halfway around the world. And this is why we saw third parties printing parts, 3D printing parts for ventilators in Italian hospitals during the height of the pandemic in Italy. The answer to this, it seems to me, is not to give the companies a bunch of new obligations, although some obligations, like the ones under the right to repair bill model legislation, seem all right to me, but rather to take away these new powers that they have arrogated to themselves by using the excess profits from their monopoly to either lobby for new laws or do the expensive litigation work to get new interpretations of existing laws that make it illegal to compete with them, that make it illegal to do things that displease their shareholders. I'm really interested in the idea of a very elegant fix, which would be to just enact something like a whistleblower defense, but for interoperators. A very short law that says, notwithstanding any statute on the books, if you are modifying an existing product or service to allow a bona fide user of that product or service to do something legitimate, then you do not violate any statute. And yes, we're going to still have to ask judges to decide who's a bona fide user and what a legitimate feature is. Although we have a bunch of easy slam dunk cases, like, as the owner of some Audible books that you bought from the company, you should have the right to remove the DRM and play them on a device that Amazon hasn't blessed, right? There's no copyright infringement there, and you bought those books fair and square. So, that seems like a slam dunk. But in other cases, there might be subtle questions that have to be unpicked by judges. And I'm fine with that, because the way the status quo works today is that if you're a new market entrant and you design something that allows users of a product or service to get more value out of it. If you're someone, for example, who makes a third-party app store for iOS, the judge never has to ask whether there's a legitimate reason for that product to exist or whether an actual iPhone owner wants that product to exist. The only question they get to ask is, did you bypass a copyright lock? And if the answer is yes, then irrespective of the fact that no one's violating copyright, and irrespective of the fact that iPhone users want this and that they bought their products and they own them fair and square, Apple gets to shut you down. So I think it's really important to look beyond this question of whether you're being spied on by a product or whether the company is good or evil. I think the question that we need to keep first in mind is whether you have technological self-determination, which includes the right to decide whether you don't want to do business with a company anymore, but still want to continue to access the data or the products that you've acquired from them. It also includes the right to decide how your private data is used. This week, and I'll finish with this before we go to, and then go to questions. This week, a company called Wink that makes home automation systems told its customers that although they had sold them the products fair and square, and promised that they would never spy on them and that they could use the products forever, that because the pandemic had really hurt their finances, they were going to give those customers 1 week to decide whether they wanted to pay a $5 a month subscription fee. And if they didn't, they were just going to take away all the devices. They would kill switch them so that they no longer did any of the things those customers had paid for. And look, I'm very sympathetic to people whose finances are in trouble during the pandemic. My finances are in trouble during the pandemic. I have 3 books out this year. It's a scary time to have a lot of big bets that you've made, like, writing and releasing a book. And for during a time of downturn when you can't do book tours and so on. But I don't think that my publisher should be able to reach into your devices and say, look, we know you enjoyed Cory's previous books, but in order to make sure that the next one is viable, we're going to take those books away from you unless you give us 99 cents, right? Irrespective of how important it is to me for those books to come out, I don't think it's fair to say that the products you acquired should belong to you, or should not belong to you, should be subject to recall if I decide that I should have charged you more, or I want to put you over a barrel. And so, you know, I like the claims that Apple makes to being privacy respecting, and that Wink makes to being privacy respecting. But any firm that says that your enjoyment of their product is contingent on their continuing goodwill towards you is not a firm that you should treat as your friend, even if they're not spying on you. And I think that, you know, as evil as Google is, Apple and any other company is equally evil if they are not willing to let you decide how you're going to use their products. Okay, so with that all said, I would love to take your questions. I think we're doing that through the chat, and let me get my chat window open here. It seems to have disappeared when we went full screen. There it is. Yeah. Okay. And Gadi, I think I saw you pop in and out there. Are you, I'm doing my questions, but are you gonna
Absolutely.
paste them
So
into
let
the
me just say to everybody, as you look at what I'm sending to you right now, appreciate this stuff. There is a lot of feedback. I just want to make sure you see in the chat I just sent you. Thank you everybody for listening to this. Next up, we're going to have essentially Cory take the questions, and it's more of an interactive thing. So please feel free to just write your questions right now in the chat to add to that. And as we go through that, Cory will lead us through the next about 25 minutes. Then we'll go to our reading from Alan Lightman, and then we'll go to the panel. So on that note, thank you, Cory, and feel free to take it away and give us whatever you think is right.
There's so many good questions here, and I'm going through all of them because I want to get the good ones.
I think they're all good ones, and we've been lucky today.
All good ones.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see.
I would also add that we have attendees who actually understand what they're talking about and are more than happy, passionate geeks, which I truly appreciate.
Right. Okay. So there's a good question here. What can we do to change the default to from being closed off by Daniel Gold ... So I'm going to assume, maybe if I make that window better, Daniel Goldberg. Hi, Daniel Goldberg. So what can we do to make the default be open? I gave a talk a couple of years ago at the Libre Planet conference that the Free Software Foundation organizes about this, because, you know, obviously this is the thing that they have been beating the drum on for 30 years, that things should be open. And more recently, the lead of the Samba project gave a talk about openness and freedom and what it means in a world of software as a service. And then there's a third talk also at Libre Planet by Benjamin Mako Hill, the keynote from 2019, I want to say, about openness and freedom. So my talk, and I want to pull those all together to answer this question. So my talk was about how the free software movement liked to divide all of software into software that's proprietary and software that's freely licensed. And if it's freely licensed, you have the freedom to run the code, inspect the code, improve the code, and publish your improvements. And if it's proprietary, you don't have one or more of those rights because of licensing restrictions or some other restriction. And I posed to them that there's actually a level of proprietary that they should be much more alarmed about than merely proprietary, merely something that is a copyright violation to use the code as you would. And that is code that defines a product that has DRM in it. And the reason that matters is that if you have a product that is proprietary, you can reverse engineer it and make a non-proprietary interoperable version of it. So, you know, for example, Microsoft, one of the ways that they tried to cement their dominance over the small office and enterprise market was by having a closed proprietary networking protocol called SMB, and they had a rival, or rather, there was a grad student in Australia who decided to reverse engineer SMB, and so he reverse engineered it, and he made it free software, and he called it Samba, and a bunch of other programmers around the world, a lot of them people who administered large networks of heterogeneous computers that had to support Windows machines, improved that code until it was fully compatible. And today, Samba is in most devices that you buy, right? It's like, it's in your phone, and it's in kind of everything, because it's like how your phone talks to your printer, and how your home CCTV talks to your file server to dump video onto it, or what have you. And the thing about DRM is it makes that reverse engineering step a felony, right? That if you have to bypass encryption in order to make the interoperable product, then even if you don't violate anyone's copyright, even if you don't violate a patent, even if you never violate terms of service, you have broken the law. And so I think that fighting over whether or not stuff is open is really important, or free is really important. But there is this whole other dimension of stuff that is far more proprietary than mere proprietariness, right? There's the stuff that you have to do a lot of work to make an interoperable product with. And then there's the stuff that you go to jail if you make an interoperable product with. And it seems to me that we focus unduly, like we're fighting the last war, right? We're fighting the war over closed and open source, as opposed to the war over whether or not it's a felony to understand how your product works, how the product you rely on works. And then I want to talk about what Jeremy Allison from the Samba Project said in his talk in January. He said, now that everything is software as a service, it doesn't really matter if you have the source code. Having the source code that defines, say, the backend for Google's cloud doesn't do you any good, because even though you have the right to modify it, improve it, and publish your modifications, you don't have the right to actually get Google to change its backend. And when you're talking about devices that are connected to the internet, like say your printer, if you have a problem with your printer and you get the source code to that printer because they've built it on some free or open source project, and you get it from the manufacturer, and you find the bug and you fix it and you issue a patch, the manufacturer may not take the patch. And if they don't, there may be some kind of signing function in the printer that stops you from installing the patched code. So even though you have the theoretical right to run the code, as a practical matter, you can't run the code, even if you can see the code and improve it. And that brings me to what Benjamin Mako Hill said at his LibrePlanet keynote, which is that what has happened to free software is that it's become open source. That open source was originally posed as kind of a business-friendly way to talk about software freedom, one that wouldn't scare businesses away by focusing on the ethical dimension of software freedom, the human right to understand your code, improve your code, modify your code, and so on, and instead would focus on the utilitarian values of making the code better, right? And maybe making it cheaper to develop, that if it's free and open, other people will do some work for you, the quality will be higher because you'll have more eyeballs on it and they'll find the bugs and so on. And that as things have moved into the cloud, we've ended up in a world in which we all have open source, which is to say we can look at the source, we can make improvements to the source, but we don't have any freedom. That the software freedom still really matters to business. In fact, it matters more to business than open source. And the reason it matters is they want the freedom of the software, and they don't want their users to have the freedom of the software. They want us to have open source, and they want to have freedom. And so I would say that our focus needs to be not merely on openness, but on freedom. And making things free by default requires two different things. So one is to put obligations on firms, and then the other one is to take away special rights from firms. Congress never wrote a "you're not allowed to fix your stuff" law, and they never wrote a "you're not allowed to put third-party ink in your printer" law, and they never wrote a law that said, your email, your social graph, once it's locked up in Facebook, you're not allowed to access it anymore. What's happened is that companies have bootstrapped existing laws into new cyber weapons that they can use to take away rights from their customers. And so that's what I was talking about when I talked about an interoperator's defense, that if we can find a way to strip companies of weapons that were never theirs to begin with, that no legislature ever handed them, then that's step one. And an Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I do consulting work, we have a lawsuit on behalf of a cryptographer named Matthew Green from Johns Hopkins, and a hardware hacker and entrepreneur and electrical engineer from MIT called Andrew Bunny Wang, who some of you may know from his work hacking the Xbox. And we're trying to strike down the DMCA. It's a long process because courts move slowly, but that I think is a step in the right direction. The second question about how we put obligations on firms is one that's if anything, thornier, because the problem with putting obligations on firms is they can become licenses, right? You know, if you think about AT&T during the Bell System years, giving AT&T the obligation to be part of the national safety and security infrastructure also meant that they were protected from any attempt to make them smaller or bring them to heel, because they could either be large enough to be part of the state, or they could be small enough that they weren't a threat to competition, but not both. So, you know, when the DOJ in '56 wanted to break them up, the Pentagon said no, right? We can't run the war in Korea without a giant Ma Bell. And so it wasn't for another 30 years that you saw them be broken up, or 27 years, 1982, that they were finally broken up into their composite pieces, because the obligation that had been put on them became this license to operate. And so I like the right to repair approach for at least for repairs, which is to say you have to provide manuals, technical documentation. You have to sell parts on a free and non-discriminatory basis, or reasonable and non-discriminatory basis to all comers. You know, that if your complaint is that people will do bad repairs if anyone's allowed to fix it, your only remedy is to make it easier to do good repairs by documenting how your stuff works better, and so on. And that's the kind of obligation that I think works well. You see some leverage in procurement where states or hospital systems or anyone else who works with sensitive information systems that have a lot of leverage because they buy a lot of it. They can say, look, as a condition of doing business with us, you have to allow us to second source this. You have to give us everything we need to allow another company, a competitor of yours, to continue to service it. At its best, this is what militaries do. They require second sourcing. And indeed, some of the early, I was just talking with someone about early adversarial interoperability. Some of the earliest adversarial interoperability was during the Civil War, when the Union required that the people who made their firearms use standardized components so that they could have third-party repair in the field. And so I think we have some of those levers as well. Deliberate, malicious.
There are really a lot of good questions coming in. We're going to try to get to as many of them as possible today.
Right.
And then we will essentially see how many we can get in, and maybe go a little bit longer than we usually do.
Yeah, and I don't want to keep the panel waiting, because they're an esteemed panel who are very interesting people, and we can probably get into some of this too. In fact, I see some of this from the panelists. So Caleb asks, what about small companies that use DRM to fence off big companies? And what about personal data? Shouldn't that be DRM'd? So I don't think personal data DRMing personal data helps with privacy. I think encrypting personal data helps with privacy. DRM has this specific meaning in the context of, say, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is DRM makes it DRM is an effective means of access control to a copyrighted work. So, like, most personal data is not a copyrighted work to begin with; it's factual. But also, you know, if what we're talking about is just encryption, which is to say you know, if you want your hospital to encrypt your data at rest and in motion, that's great. What we don't want is for the hospital to not be able to choose another vendor to add an interoperable product, or to not be able to turn over a clear text to you if you choose to leave that hospital. And that's what DRM would get the hospital if their EHRs had DRM on them as opposed to encryption, right? The distinction between DRM and encryption, I guess, is who has the key, to get back to this idea of Doctorow's first law. that if the keys are held by by someone other than the person whose data it is, and the person whose data it is can't get the keys, then the data is not being encrypted to protect that person. It's being encrypted to do something to coerce that person, to take away their technological self-determination. So I'm all for encryption at rest. You know, when I was with, I was at EFF when we were helping to write the California breach notification laws that created a limited liability shield for firms that encrypted data at rest if they suffered a breach, and so on. So I'm all for encrypting user data. I just think that DRM is the wrong way to think about this. And particularly when we're talking about DRM to somehow stop your data from leaking after you give it to people, right? That's the case that we often hear for DRM and data, which is things like Microsoft Information Rights Management tool, which has gone through several iterations. I don't know what they're calling it these days, but the idea is that I can send you a PowerPoint deck, but you can't send that PowerPoint deck to anyone else. And I think as a practical matter, that just doesn't work, right? Like if what you're worried about is that you told a secret to someone who's not trustworthy, that person can merely repeat the secret, right? They can capture the data by taking a picture of their screen. They can capture the data by running the system in a VM. They can capture the data by learning what it says and telling it to a third party. That's just security theater at that point, right? Like, I've sent you a PowerPoint deck, but it doesn't have a save button, doesn't mean that I now no longer have to worry about my information leaking, right? No amount of DRM will make it possible to know who you should trust with sensitive information. Knowing who you should trust with sensitive information is a matter either of the very idiosyncratic personal calculus that an individual makes, or of some nexus of good judgment and regulation in the context of firms, right? I want hospitals to only transmit my prescribing data to pharmacists who are bound by a professional code of conduct and audited by outside auditors. I don't want their line of defense to be that they've sent them my prescription in an encrypted wrapper that they can't unwrap to allow it to do interoperable things in their own system that would allow the people who made that system to prevent them, for example, from having a dispensing system that was that came from a third party, so that they could monopolize not just EHRs but also pharmaceutical data. And in particular, I think that it's very important not to allow DRM to block off the auditing of those systems, right? If we're talking about personal information, sensitive information, we don't want, we want things to be encrypted, but we don't want them to be DRM, because if they're DRM, then third-party security experts who audit those systems risk felony prosecution for publishing proof of concept code. And we certainly don't want people who make systems that handle our personal information to have a veto over who can make truthful assertions about defects in their products. That you know, if such a veto were to exist, it certainly shouldn't be entrusted to the companies that you know, make the products that are potentially being criticized or having their defects pointed out. And then smaller firms using DRM to wall off bigger firms. You know, there aren't any, I haven't seen any great examples of this, right? You know, you don't often see small firms that aren't dominant having to worry about interoperability, blocking interoperability from big firms, because generally speaking, they want that, right? Like if you make a, I don't know, if you make a car stereo, you want to be able to plug it into any car that's on the market. And if someone who makes a car decides to start putting your stereo in and is selling your stereo, that's not a net negative for you. I think that it mistakes the power dynamic. And I'd love to, maybe during the panel, you can give me some examples of that. Can a balance be found between... So Raris Dumitras asks about the right to repair and intellectual theft from offshore companies. I just don't think there's any nexus there. I think you've misunderstood what right to repair does, right? So right to repair doesn't strip you of or maybe you're defining intellectual theft, which isn't a thing, so broadly that it captures a bunch of things that I think of as legitimate. I don't see any reason that a firm should have the right to decide who can fix a thing after I bought it. I don't see any reason why a firm should have the right to be the only company that makes parts for it. In the same reason that I don't think KitchenAid gets to decide which bread I put in my toaster, I don't think a printer company should get to decide whose ink I put in my printer. If what you're talking about is someone counterfeiting a product, right to repair doesn't in any way undermine the right to block counterfeiting. Counterfeiting in this context means deceptively marketing a third-party product as coming from the first party, slapping an Apple logo on a thing that didn't come from Apple, not writing compatible with Apple, but rather writing made by Apple. That's counterfeiting, and there's nothing in right to repair that stops firms from doing it. If it's violating a patent, well, your patents are intact, even under the broadest right to repair legislation. So I think it's a red herring. All right. So yeah, Dan's got a good question. As a data scientist who works with healthcare, what's the right balance for data collection and personal and privacy, right? What about should a smart toilet, is a smart toilet invasive of your privacy or not? And I guess my answer is that people are going to have different choices that they make about that. And those choices are going to be hard to get right. It is very hard to anticipate what the consequences of a privacy disclosure will be in the moment. And this is something I'm hoping to get the panel to talk about a little. But you may not realize when you give away some of your data that it might be combined with some other data in the future in a harmful way. And so guessing right about it is really, really hard. And also people will have different tolerances and different threat models and different concerns. So what I would say is that if you are going to collect data from people, in addition to the stuff that we already know about in terms of medical ethics, like informed consent, I think you also have to give people technological self-determination. That that the right of the person who is gathering the data to get accurate data is less important than the right of the person whose data is being gathered to modify the system to guard the things that they care about as being private. And after there was a tainted blood scandal in Canada when I was growing up, the Red Cross deliberately handed out HIV tainted blood because they didn't have an effective way to track it in their system. And they kind of threw their hands up and said, some people will die. That's the cost of having a blood donation system. And in the wake of that, they had all kinds of requirements put on them. And one of those requirements was that after you had gone through your screening and had your and done all the stuff you needed to do and answered all the questions with the public health nurse, you were given 2 barcodes. And one of those barcodes would tell someone down the line to throw away your blood, and the other barcode would tell them to use it. And you peeled, the public health nurse left the room, you peeled off one of those barcodes and you stuck it on your blood donation form. And then you put the remaining one in a shredder box that was locked up so they couldn't see which one you had chosen. And the reason for that is that we knew that if we forced people to answer questions like, do you patronize sex workers? Are you in the closet but engaged in high-risk gay activity or what have you? Are you an IV drug user? That they would sometimes lie, right? That people would go to an employer-sponsored blood drive and then have to answer awkward questions about why they weren't allowed to give blood. And so they would just lie and they would put tainted blood into the system. And so we gave people the right to decide when to throw away their samples. We gave people the right effectively to lie to public health nurses. And then we mitigated the fact that we knew that they would lie sometimes to public health nurses by creating a kind of backstop in the form of these barcodes. And I think that, like, if my employer requires me to install a smart toilet that monitors my drug use, it should be my right to hire a third party to modify my toilet to lie to my employer about my drug use. And that if we think that doing otherwise will catch people who are using drugs that that might put something at risk, then we need a backup for that, because the reality is that people are going to find a way around it if it's in their own home anyway. And so if that's our only way to guard against risk, then just like you would have tainted blood in the blood supply system, you'll have pilots who are, you know, taking opioids on the weekend, showing up for work. And that the right way to manage this is not with pervasive surveillance, but rather with, you know, targeted interventions, right? With like checking the blood before you put it in someone's arm, or by checking someone's intoxication levels before they get behind the yoke of a cockpit, but not having this continuous ongoing surveillance. How are we doing for time here? I think we're at time to start the panel here. There are many questions in the
We are
chat
happy
that
for
I
you
didn't
to
get
go over a little bit. And we'll tell you it's
well,
the
maybe
last
I'll
question.
do one more. I'll do one more question, then. Let me just
Sounds
the
good.
way my
Take your
screens are
time. We
arranged, it's
appreciate
hard
it.
for me to look at the Q&A here.
We have seen a lot of interest, and we'll always send you these questions later.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so from Nemanja Yannick, or Nemanja Yannick, or Nemanja Janik, do you have an opinion on how the points you made could relate to non-EU and non-US countries? So in the case of software patents, there's more of a hodgepodge. In the EU, there are fewer software patents than there are in the US. Although there's still scope for some software patents. In the US, we've seen a weakening of the worst kind of software patent. For a long time, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office was saying you could patent literally anything provided you added the words "with a computer" to it. So, you know, things that people did in the real world all the time that were by no means inventions. Once you added the words "with a computer," they became inventions. And a decision called Alice nerfed that pretty hard, and the Supreme Court recently upheld it. But the U.S. Patent Office is ignoring that Supreme Court decision. So we're going to see probably a showdown there. But the rest of the world generally has a better policy on software patents, not 100%, but is generally a little better. In terms of anti-circumvention rules, the rules that prohibit bypassing a copyright access control, even if you aren't violating copyright, most of the world has done very badly on this. Canada, the US, and the EU, I mentioned. Any high-income nation has been pressured by the US Trade Representative to adopt rules that are very similar to it. For example, the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement brought in very similar rules. The one-off deals struck with Andean nations in South America, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, they all brought in these rules. In fact, I once taught a seminar where the Costa Rican IP negotiator was one of my students for the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and she said that she'd gotten a phone call from their negotiator, from their agricultural negotiator, saying the U.S. Trade Representative says that we can't export soybeans to them unless we give them anti-circumvention. And she said, well, we shouldn't give them anti-circumvention. And he said, well, we won't have an economy if we can't export our soybeans. And so they rolled over on that. So almost every country in the world has this. The one exception is Israel. Mostly, I think, because the U.S. Trade Representative has other priorities in Israel. There have been bills before the Knesset. The Knesset obviously is in massive disarray, but there have been bills before the Knesset to adopt versions of the anti-circumvention rule. None of them, to my knowledge, have passed. The local expert on this is a guy named Nimrod Kozlov, who's very good on this. But yeah, I think everywhere else, in every high-income nation and many nations that are lower income, except for some least developed nations, have versions of this rule, thanks to the U.S. Trade Representative. Anti-hacking laws tend to be, if anything, a little worse outside of the U.S., in part because the jurisprudence in the U.S. has been tempered a little by the First Amendment and the kind of rigid constitutional tradition the U.S. has, which, you know, for good or for evil, does in fact put some bounds, ceilings and floors on policy in the U.S. But yeah, it's pretty similar in most of the world, for sure. There's a secondary question of whether it's enforced, right? One of the things I'm hoping to get into with the panel is the question of national champions, as they say in the European policy circles. The idea that you could have tech companies that serve as part of your the way your nation projects power over the world, the way, say, Nokia did for Finland, or that AT&T did for the US. And in those cases, for example, with Huawei or Tencent, you see nations turning a blind eye to conduct that's technically against the law in those countries, especially when the violations are committed in some way that's in the national interest. But even when it's not in the national interest, you see it done sometimes when you have this presumption that the national interest is served just by profits for the firm. What's good for GM is good for America. What's good for Huawei is good for China. Even if there's no direct line to something that Huawei does that would be illegal if some other firm in China did it, and power for the Chinese state, a more powerful Huawei is presumptively better for the Chinese state. So with that, I think maybe we should move on to the panel.
Thank you for that, first of all, Cory, I appreciate it. We are going to take about 5 to 10 minutes to have a reading from Keren. Keren will join us in just a second. And thank you for that, and see you very soon again.
Very good.
Very good. So on that note, I would like to introduce Keren, who is reading for us every single week. And she's gonna read something for us from Alan Lightman, and also maybe talk to us a little bit about her own experience with what Cory has said. Hello, Keren.
Hi, Gadi. Thank you for the intro. And Cory, that was a really amazing talk. Thank you so much. Yeah, I had spent the last several years working on a company called Paribus that used bots and scrapers to, at our users' request, log into their online shopping accounts for them and request partial refunds on their behalf, and absolutely faced opposition from the retailers, most notably Amazon, who would try to block us both technically but also socially, telling our users that we were hackers, which is, of course, a strange word for someone you've explicitly asked to do something on your behalf. So a lot of what you're saying really resonates. But I digress. This is meant to be a palate cleanser. And I am excited to share with you one of my favorite readings. This is a short essay I excerpted from a book called Einstein's Dreams by Alan Lightman, who is a physicist, writer, social entrepreneur, was the first professor at MIT to be appointed in both the sciences and the humanities, and who will be an upcoming guest on one of our shows in August, where we will talk with him and explore the intersection between art, science, and art about science. And so with this, I give you an essay about time and the nature of time. In this world, there are two times. There is mechanical time and there is body time. The first is as rigid and metallic as a massive pendulum of iron that swings back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The second squirms and wriggles like a bluefish in a bay. The first is unyielding, predetermined. The second makes up its mind as it goes along. Many are convinced that mechanical time does not exist. When they pass the giant clock on the Kramgasse, they do not see it, nor do they hear its chimes while sending packages on Postgasse or strolling between flowers in the Rosengarten. They wear watches on their wrists, but only as ornaments or as courtesies to those who would give timepieces as gifts. They do not keep clocks in their houses. Instead, they listen to their heartbeats. They feel the rhythms of their moods and desires. Such people eat when they are hungry, go to their jobs at the millinery or the chemist's whenever they wake from their sleep, make love all hours of the day. Such people laugh at the thought of mechanical time. They know that time moves in fits and starts. They know that time struggles forward with a weight on its back when they are rushing an injured child to the hospital or bearing the gaze of a neighbor wronged. And they know too that time darts across the field of vision when they are eating well with friends or receiving praise or lying in the arms of a secret lover. Then there are those who think that their bodies don't exist. They live by mechanical time. They rise at 7 o'clock in the morning. They eat their lunch at noon and their supper at 6. They arrive at their appointments on time, precisely by the clock. They make love between 8 and 10 at night. They work 40 hours a week, read the Sunday paper on Sunday, play chess on Tuesday nights. When their stomach growls, they look at their watch to see if it is time to eat. When they begin to lose themselves in a concert, they look at the clock above the stage to see when it will be time to go home. They know that the body is not a thing of wild magic, but a collection of chemicals, tissues, and nerve impulses. Thoughts are no more than electrical surges in the brain. Sexual arousal is no more than a flow of chemicals to certain nerve endings. Sadness no more than a bit of acid transfixed in the cerebellum. In short, the body is a machine, subject to the same laws of electricity and mechanics as an electron or clock. As such, the body must be addressed in the language of physics. And if the body speaks, it is the speaking of only so many levers and forces. The body is a thing to be ordered, not obeyed. Taking the night air along the river Ara, one sees evidence for two worlds in one. A boatman gauges his position in the dark by counting seconds drifted in the water's current. 1, 3 meters, 2, 6 meters, 3, 9 meters. His voice cuts through the black in clean and certain syllables. Beneath a lamppost on the Niddig Bridge, two brothers who have not seen each other for a year stand and drink and laugh. The bell of St. Vincent's Cathedral sings 10 times. In seconds, lights in the apartments lining Schifflob wink out in a perfect mechanized response, like the deductions of Euclid's geometry. Lying on the riverbank, two lovers look up lazily, awakened from a timeless sleep by the distant church bells, surprised to find that night has come. Where the two times meet, desperation. Where the two times go their separate ways, contentment. For miraculously, a barrister, a baker, a nurse can make a world in either time, but not in both times. Each time is true, but the truths are not the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Keren. I do appreciate it. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about Alan?
Yes, Alan has he wrote his most famous book, Einstein's Dreams, some 20 to 30 years ago. It was a while, and his most recent is, I believe, called Three Bridges. He has spent his life working sort of at the intersection of art and science, and will be coming on to talk with us in August sometime and host a panel, I believe, where we talk to folks who've worked in different corners of the intersection of the two. But his work has spanned a lot of different genres. He's written poetry. My personal favorite way of sharing this is actually as a verbal reading. Often when people are about to go sort of switch modes and go, we've all hurried to be somewhere and now we're about to enjoy a party or an event. I like to share this reading as a way to have a thoughtful moment about how we engage with moments, other people,
I hear that you actually go around parties and force people to listen to you reading this.
Force is a strong word. I do tend to pounce on people and try to read them some of my favorite things. I've done this on roofs and closets, and so I will say in my defense, some of them have taken to doing the same.
Well, that's a movement right there. But no,
yes.
Thank you again, Keren. Always a pleasure.
All right, thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you. And on that note, I'll call back Cory, as well as various friends who will join us on this panel, including Steve Crocker, Keren Elazari, Ron Gula, Dmitri Alperovich, and Caleb.